morning, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be back in Kansas City, particularly after spending about 7 hours on the floor of a Dulles Airport waiting room yesterday. Chicago, and the weather in Chicago basically screwed up the entire air traffic system in the United States yesterday, as we all learned. We got here, and it is a pleasure to be back here. This is one of my favorite communities in the United States, and I'm particularly looking forward, if I can sneak it in, to visit the World War I Museum this afternoon. I want to commend the Housing Choices Coalition, and in some respects, I could just stop and just repeat what Tim was saying, because there's going to be so much synergy and integration between what Tim was talking about and I will discuss. I have enormous respect for this coalition because I think it understands that housing and affordable housing is not just an end, it's a means to multiple ends. And when housing policy expands choices, whether it's housing type, whether it's housing location, whether it's housing product, it really treats housing as a platform to give families the ability to live closer to good schools and quality jobs. If they're homeowners, the ability to grow assets, meet the demands of retirement and college education and medical emergencies. At the regional level, a smart, choice-informed housing policy, I think, gives the broader community a vehicle for achieving growth patterns that are competitively wise and environmentally sustainable and fiscally efficient. I think, as Tim said, if housing policy is going to achieve its full potential, it's going to have to be crafted not in isolation, but in tandem with related policies like transportation, land use, economic development, financial services, and even education. And today I really want to focus on one of those interrelationships and talk about the necessity of joining up transportation, land use, and housing policies in the service of competitiveness and fiscal austerity. First, I want to present some powerful national and regional evidence about the inextricable link between housing and transportation costs. For too long, we've really defined housing affordability, I think, in limited ways. We've really only measured the relationship of housing costs to incomes and wages. Yet in today's distended, what I call the exit ramp economy, where 40% of the commutes are from suburb to suburb, we must combine housing and transportation costs together if we're going to get a true picture of the burdens that are being placed on working families in the broader region. Now, the recent study that I'm going to talk about shows that the Kansas City Metro stands out as a place where transportation costs are, on average, far outstripping the cost of housing, and that's placing severe demand on working families struggling to make ends meet. Now, second, I want to explain why that's happening. Unbalanced, unfocused, unsustainable growth patterns are really compelling many working families to live far away from the places where they work and to live in neighborhoods that really lack the density or connectivity that enable a broad range of transportation choices beyond the car. I think many families in this region and really across the country are making a brutal trade-off between buying homes at reasonable prices only to find that they need to purchase and maintain 2 or 3 cars to carry out the necessities of daily life. Now, unfocused growth, as we now know from really the past 15 years of economic and environmental literature, is also imposing some real costs on the region as a whole, and it's threatening long-term competitiveness in a changing economy. I really believe to compete going forward, this country, this metropolitan area, needs to think about growing in different ways. And that's what I want to end on. How do you do that? What are the changes? What are the ways that this region, your states, the country as a whole can develop policies that can facilitate more balanced growth patterns? So let me just first talk about the evidence, because I think it's quite striking. And whenever you do these national studies, you're always looking for places that really are at one end of the continuum, because that shows you, I think, a way to proceed. In October 2006, the Center for Housing Policy, on the board of which I sit on, released a national study entitled A Heavy Load, the combined housing and transportation burdens of working families. Now, this study built on earlier research that we had done, that others had done, that examined the not surprising fact that working families that move further and further out in the search for low-cost housing pay higher and higher transportation costs. It's just common sense. The earlier research had found that nationally, for every dollar a working family saves on housing, it spends 77 cents more in transportation. But here's the kicker. At some distance, usually about 12 to 15 miles away from a region center of employment, the increase in transportation costs outweighs the savings on housing, and the share of household income required to meet these combined expenditures rises. Now, the 2006 study went further, and it examined the combined cost of housing and transportation for working families. And these are families earning between $20,000 and $50,000 a year, living in some 28 metropolitan areas, including the Kansas City metro. On average, this study found that working families spend about 57% of their income on the combined costs of housing and transportation, roughly 28% of income for housing, 29% for transportation. Now, as you'd expect, those combined costs vary markedly from metro to metro and even within metros. Across metros, the combination of housing and transportation costs are affected by a broad range of factors: the nature of your economy, the health and vitality of your central city and your older suburbs, the extent of employment decentralization, the concentration of poverty, the level of racial and ethnic segregation, the maturity and reach of public transit, so forth and so on. Now, those combined costs, housing and transportation, range from a low of 54% in Pittsburgh to a high of 63% in San Francisco. So how do you stack up? In many ways, this metro is a study in contrast. On average, working families, again earning between $20,000 and $50,000 a year, pay about 56% of their total income on housing and transportation costs. That's just below the national metropolitan average. Yet the split between housing and transportation costs is wildly uneven. On one hand, and Tim referenced this, working families spend only 23% of their income on housing. That's the second lowest among all the metros studied. Only working families in the Pittsburgh metro spend a lower portion of their income on housing. I think everyone in this room understands the dire economic straits that the Pittsburgh metro is in. On the other hand, working families in Kansas City spend an incredible 33% of their income on transportation. And that puts you at the head of the pack, along with Tampa and Pittsburgh. And the average transportation cost for working families in Kansas City is almost $11,000 per household. That's the highest total of all the metropolitan area study.